Her ex laughed at her with his rich bride. The mafia boss chose her first before everyone. He looked straight at her and laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not an uncomfortable laugh, a slow, deliberate laugh, the kind a man uses when he wants someone to understand exactly where they stand. Ethan Caldwell stood in a $5,000 tuxedo beside the most expensive woman in the room, and when his eyes found Claire Whitmore behind the vendor table, her hands still dusty from unpacking fabric bolts, her vendor badge clipped to a dress she'd sewn herself, he didn't look away. He let her see it, the amusement, the satisfaction. The quiet verdict that said, "Look at where you ended up. Look at where I ended up. Do you understand now why I left?" Claire understood. She turned back to her work without a word. But here's what Ethan didn't know, and what the rest of that night was about to teach him. If this story hit something real inside you, subscribe to this channel right now, and follow Claire's story all the way to the end, because what happens next will stay with you. Hit the like button, drop a comment with the city and country where you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Don't disappear, because what comes next changes everything. The morning of the Harrington-Caldwell engagement celebration, Claire Whitmore arrived at the Grand Meridian Hotel at 6:45 in the morning with a rented cargo van, a pulled muscle in her left shoulder from the previous delivery, and a vendor contract that represented the single largest job her company had ever booked. She hadn't slept well. She never slept well before a big setup day. Her mind ran inventory lists in the dark. How many yards of fabric? How many table runners? How many wooden dowels and tension rings and brass clips? She'd triple-checked her supply order at midnight and found a discrepancy in the ivory organza yardage. She'd fixed it herself by going back to her studio at 1 in the morning and cutting the additional footage by hand under a single overhead light while her dog slept on the cutting table beside her. That was Claire's life. That had always been Claire's life. She was not a woman who waited for problems to solve themselves. The hotel loading dock smelled like dish soap and diesel. 2 other vendor teams were already jockeying for elevator access, a florist with a mountain of white hydrangeas and a lighting crew hauling aluminum truss sections. Claire waited her turn. She drank terrible coffee from a paper cup. She went over the floor plan again on her phone, even though she had it memorized. By 8 o'clock, she and her 2-person team, Marcus, her setup coordinator, and a college student named Priya, who worked part-time, had begun draping the first of the guest tables in the ballroom's east wing. The fabric Claire had designed for this event was a deep champagne silk with a subtle, geometric weave that caught the light differently depending on the angle. She'd spent 11 days developing the pattern. The client had no idea. Clients rarely did. That was fine. Claire wasn't building a reputation for credit. She was building one for results. By noon, the ballroom was beginning to look like something. Marcus kept calling it crazy good every time he stepped back to look at a finished section. Priya had started photographing everything for Claire's portfolio. The hotel events coordinator stopped by twice just to stare. Claire was on her knees, adjusting the hemline of a fabric backdrop panel, an irritating gap where the tension rod had slipped when she heard the voices from the corridor. Loud voices, entitled voices. The particular kind that comes from people who have spent their entire lives being listened to without having to raise their volume. She recognized one of them immediately. She didn't look up, kept working on the panel, her hands steady, her jaw tight. The doors opened. "Just need to see the room before the florist finishes," a woman's voice said, clear and crisp, the accent of expensive schools. "It'll be fine, Vanessa," a man's voice, also familiar, more familiar. Claire heard footsteps cross the ballroom floor. She stayed low behind the backdrop panel, not hiding she was genuinely working. But she wasn't going to straighten up and announce herself. She had no reason to. She was a vendor doing a job. This wasn't her room. It had never been her room. The footsteps stopped nearby. "This fabric is actually gorgeous," the woman Vanessa said. "Is this the designer they brought in?" "Some company out of the Wicker Park area, I think." Claire heard something shift in his voice the second time. A slight flattening, like a man trying to sound neutral about something that wasn't neutral. She stood up. Ethan Caldwell was 10 feet away. He looked good. She'd grant him that, without it costing her anything. He'd put on weight in a way that looked intentional, broader shoulders, a jaw that had settled into something more defined. The tuxedo was perfectly fitted. He looked like someone had spent a great deal of money, making sure he looked like he'd never had to think about money. Beside him, Vanessa Harrington was exactly what Claire had expected. From the name, tall, blonde, wearing something simple that definitely wasn't simple, radiating the effortless composure of a woman who had never once needed to choose between fixing a billing error and eating a real meal. She wasn't cruel looking. That was almost the hardest thing. She just looked like someone who belonged in a different category of world than Claire had ever been assigned to. Ethan saw Claire at the same moment Claire stood up. Something moved behind his eyes. Not guilt, not shame. Something faster and colder, a quick calculation. An assessment. His eyes traveled from Claire's face to her vendor badge, to the fabric in her hands, to the modest setup table near the entrance with her company name Claire Whitmore Textile Design printed on a small banner that now, in this context, in this ballroom, in front of this woman, felt painfully small. Then Ethan smiled. Not at Vanessa, at Claire, slowly, deliberately, with the full weight of what the smile was meant to communicate. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The laugh that followed, low and quiet, barely more than an exhale, said everything. His silence was too elegant to say out loud. Still here, still setting up tables, still exactly where I thought you'd be. Claire felt it move through her like cold water, not because it broke her, because it didn't. And the fact that it didn't, the fact that she was able to stand there with champagne silk in both hands and feel that particular croquetie land on her skin without flinching, told her something about how far she'd come since the morning 3 years ago when she'd read his text message 4 times before she understood it wasn't a mistake. I need someone on my level now. 7 words, no phone call, no conversation. No acknowledgement of the 4 years they'd built together, the cramped apartment, the ramen dinners, the $400 she'd pulled out of her studio's emergency fund to cover his rent when his first finance job fell through, the interview suit she'd altered 3 times until it fit him like he'd been born wearing it, the presentation she'd stayed up until 3 in the morning, helping him revise. He'd walked into Chicago's money circle wearing a suit she'd sewn tighter at the waist and looser at the shoulders, and decided the woman who'd fitted it didn't belong in the room. 7 words. She'd allowed herself 20 minutes to fall apart. She'd set a timer. When it went off, she washed her face and went back to the cutting table. Now she stood in his engagement party ballroom, with her hands full of the fabric that was making his fiancée say, "This is actually gorgeous." And she watched him laugh at her, and she refused to give him the version of herself that would make his satisfaction complete. She turned back to the backdrop panel. She kept working. Behind her, she heard Vanessa say something complimentary about the geometric weave. She heard Ethan agree in that easy, confident way he'd learned since acquiring wealthy friends, like he'd always had opinions about fabric. Claire pressed a tension clip into place, checked the hemline, moved to the next panel. The afternoon wore on. At 3 o'clock, a second group arrived, security personnel in dark suits, who moved through the ballroom with practiced efficiency. They didn't speak to the vendor teams. They clocked exits, checked sightlines, positioned themselves near doors. Whoever was coming to this party required a different level of preparation than floral arrangements. Marcus noticed before Claire did. "Who are these people for?" he said quietly, drifting close. "None of our business," Claire said. "Finish the West Wing." By 5 o'clock, the ballroom was nearly complete. Claire cheers the sound of the room with her clipboard and worked through the checklist with the kind of focus that required, and not ignoring how tired her shoulder felt and how hungry she was, and the lingering, low-grade humiliation of that smile 3 hours ago. 5:47, the power went out, not gradually. All at once, the chandeliers, the recessed lighting, the service corridor fluorescence, the exit signs, everything plunging 400 square feet of finished ballroom into absolute darkness. Outside the ballroom, she could hear guests beginning to arrive in the lobby. She could hear the beginning of crowd noise, confused, then louder, then the particular edge that crowds develop when they don't understand what's happening. Inside the ballroom, Marcus grabbed her arm. "Claire, the equipment." "I know," she was already moving. "Get Priya. The shipping cases are by the east service door. I can't see anything. Neither can anyone else. Use your phone light." She turned on her own phone's flashlight and began moving through the darkness. The ballroom chairs were obstacles. The fabric backdrop panels were obstacles. Everything she'd spent the day building was now a maze she had to navigate backward, while keeping the flashlight low enough to see the floor. She was halfway across the room when she walked directly into another person. She hit them hard shoulder first, her clipboard clattering, her phone skittering across the floor, the flashlight beam spinning and landing somewhere under a chair. She stumbled. One hand grabbed nothing. The other found a sleeve. Then a hand found her, not grabbing, not rough, just there, palm flat against her arm, catching her weight before her knee hit the floor. She got her feet under herself, found her phone, straightened up. The emergency lights came on, then dim amber strips running along the floor near the walls, barely enough to see faces, but enough. She looked up. The man who had caught her was looking down at her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. Not concern exactly, not alarm. Something quieter and more focused than either. Like a man whose first instinct, even in the dark and confusion, was simply to assess, to be accurate about what he was looking at before deciding what it meant. He was tall. She noticed that first, because he was blocking more of the amber emergency light than most people would. Then she noticed the suit charcoal, expensive, the kind of cut that didn't announce itself. Then his face, angular, still. The kind of stillness that wasn't relaxed, but controlled. There's a difference. She put him at late 30s. She noted the two men who had materialized behind him, dark suits, the particular posture of people professionally accustomed to standing near someone important, and filed that information away. "Are you hurt?" he said. His voice was lower than she expected. Not performed. Just the actual register he spoke in. "No," Claire said. She picked up her clipboard. "Sorry. I couldn't see." "Neither could I," he said, a statement, not an excuse. She nodded once and kept moving. She had equipment to protect. She had Marcus somewhere in the dark, calling her name. She had a job to finish, regardless of what the building's electrical system was choosing to do. She didn't look back. Later, much later, after the generator kicked in, after the hotel staff spent 40 minutes apologizing to guests in the lobby, the party resumed with slightly diminished chandeliers and considerably heightened tension. Claire's team finished loading the last of their fragile equipment into the van. She sat in the passenger seat while Marcus drove. Priya was asleep in the back, across a folded fabric drop cloth, within 4 minutes of the van leaving the loading dock. Marcus glanced at her. "You okay?" Shoulders sore. "That's not what I meant." She looked out the window at Chicago at night. The lake was invisible from this angle, but she knew it was out there, vast and cold and indifferent. "I'm okay," she said. She wasn't sure if that was true. She was sure she wasn't going to know until she was somewhere quiet, which wasn't yet. She thought about Ethan's face. The way the smile appeared before he'd even made a conscious decision to smile, automatic. Involuntary, the outward expression of a conclusion he'd reached about her a long time ago and hadn't bothered to revisit. She thought about the man in the dark. "Are you hurt?" The fact that his first question had been that question and not "watch where you're going" or "what are you doing in here?" She thought about her studio. The cutting table, the half-finished prototype for the next project folded over the back of her chair. She thought about a name she knew from the business corridor gossip she'd overheard when the generator finally came on. One of the hotel staff, a young woman with a reception badge, had leaned to her colleague and whispered the name with a specific quality in her voice that Claire recognized. Quality that meant not just anyone, Roman Mercer. Claire didn't know much. She didn't need to know much to understand the category. Chicago was a city that ran on 2 sets of rules, and some people only answered to one of them. She pushed the name aside. She had work to do in the morning. She had an invoice to generate and a follow-up email to send, and a studio space that needed organizing before the next project started. The van crossed onto the expressway. Behind them, the Grand Meridian's windows were lit up again. The party resuming, music pressing against the glass. Claire rolled her window down an inch. Cold air. October air. The kind that tells you winter is done considering its options. She breathed it in. She was still standing. That was the thing about Claire Whitmore that most people underestimated, including, fatally, Ethan Caldwell. She was still standing. And tomorrow she would still be working. The message arrived at Claire's studio the next morning, at 8:43. Not a text, not an email. An actual envelope, cream-colored and heavy, delivered by a man in a dark wool coat who handed it to Marcus at the front door, waited while Marcus read the exterior, and then left without asking for a signature. Marcus brought it back to where Claire was standing at the cutting table with a seam ripper and a full of pins, working on a prototype that had been bothering her for 2 days. Someone sent you an actual envelope, Marcus said. Claire took the pins out of her mouth, one at a time. Open it. It has your name on it. Then open it and read me what it says. Marcus opened it. He read it. Then he set it down on the cutting table in front of her without saying anything, which was how she knew it was something she needed to read herself. It was a contract. Formal, precise, professionally drafted, the kind of document that comes from a firm that charges $400 an hour for the pleasure. The letterhead read Mercer Holdings. The scope of work described was comprehensive, full visual production oversight for a private wedding event in 6 weeks. Custom fabrics, decor, creative direction, vendor coordination, event logistics. The fee listed at the bottom made Claire put down the seam ripper. She read it twice. Then she picked up her phone and called the number printed at the bottom of the cover letter. It rang twice, Ms. Whitmore. The voice on the other end was not Roman Mercer's voice. It belonged to a man who sounded like he'd been hired specifically for his ability to sound unremarkable. Mr. Mercer anticipated your call. He's available to speak directly if you'd like to be connected. Yes, Claire said. There was a pause, a click. Then Roman Mercer's voice, lower than the assistant's, carrying the same quality of stillness she'd noticed in the dark ballroom. Like a man who had learned at some point that silence was more effective than volume. Ms. Whitmore, Mr. Mercer. She sat down on her work stool. I need to ask you something directly. Go ahead. Why me a pause? Not a hesitant pause, a considered one. The difference between a man who doesn't know what to say and a man deciding how much truth to spend. I saw what happened last night, Roman said. Before the lights went out, Claire felt something tighten in her chest. That's not an answer. It's the beginning of one. Another pause. I watched a man publicly humiliate you in a room full of people, and I watched you turn around and keep working, like he hadn't done anything. Most people don't do that. Most people either break or they escalate. I had a job to finish. That's exactly what I mean. Claire was quiet for a moment. Through the studio window, she could see Marcus pretending to organize a bolt rack that didn't need organizing while obviously trying to hear her side of the conversation. Your sister's wedding, she said. 6 weeks, Evelyn. She's particular about what she wants. We've gone through 3 planning firms already. Why'd they not work out? The first one lied about their capacity. The second one's lead designer had a conflict of interest with one of our family's business associations. The third one just wasn't good enough. Evelyn could tell in the first meeting. And you think I'm good enough because you saw me refuse to cry in a ballroom. I think you're good enough because I looked you up this morning. Your work is exceptional. Last night confirmed you have the temperament to execute it under pressure. A beat. But yes, the ballroom was part of it. Claire looked at the contract still spread open on her cutting table. The fee. At what that fee could do to her studio's outstanding invoices, her equipment lease, the expansion she'd been pushing further down the calendar every quarter for 2 years. I need to meet in person before I agree to anything, she said. Course, somewhere neutral. Not your office. Another pause, slightly longer. There's a coffee place on Fulton Market. Spoke. Do you know it? I'll find it tomorrow. 10 o'clock. 11, Claire said. I have a client call at 9:30. The pause that followed was different from the others. She couldn't quite categorize it. It wasn't displeasure. It was almost something like recalibration. 11, Roman said. I'll be there. He hung up without pleasantries. She noticed that. No looking forward to it. No great, see you then. Just the thing agreed upon, and done. She set her phone down. Marcus stopped pretending to organize the bolt rack. Well? I have a meeting tomorrow, Claire said. She picked up the seam ripper. Finish pulling those samples for the Henderson order. That's it? That's all you're going to say? That's all there is to say right now. She went back to the prototype. Her hands were steady. Her shoulder still ached from last night. The seam she was picking apart had been sewn wrong twice, and she was going to get it right this time if she had to unpick it until midnight. She was used to that, unpicking things that had been put together wrong and doing them over until they were right. It was, when she thought about it honestly, most of what her life had been. She arrived at Spoke at 10:58. Roman Mercer was already there, Novany. He was seated at a corner table with his back to the wall, which she noticed immediately the way a person notices something without necessarily knowing why it matters. He was in a different suit than the night before. Dark navy, no tie. A coffee in front of him that looked like it had barely been touched. He was not on his phone. He was simply waiting, looking at the door. He saw her come in and stood up. She hadn't expected that. She crossed the room and sat down across from him, and he sat back down, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. She was taking him in. She assumed he was doing the same. Up close and in daylight, Roman Mercer was a different proposition than the dim amber emergency lights had suggested. The face was the same, angular, controlled, but the eyes were sharper. Kind of sharp that doesn't come from intelligence alone. Kind that comes from a life where reading people wrong has consequences. There was a scar below his left ear, half hidden by the collar of his shirt. She didn't stare at it. "You found it," he said. "You said Fulton Market." It wasn't hard. A server came. Claire ordered a black coffee. Roman waited until the server left and then opened a folder on the table between them. "I'd like to walk through the Hkopf with you directly. My attorney drafted the contract, but I want to make sure the terms reflect what Evelyn actually needs." "Tell me about Evelyn," Claire said. He looked up from the folder. "Before the contract," she said. "Tell me about your sister." Something shifted in his face. Not softened, that wasn't the right word for a face like Roman Mercer's. But the calculation behind his eyes settled into something different. "She's 26, he said. "She's been planning this wedding in her head since she was probably 14 years old. She knows exactly what she wants, and she doesn't trust people who tell her what they think she should want instead." A pause. "She's been hurt by people she trusted. She's careful now. Maybe too careful. What does the groom do?" "His name is Daniel Park. He's an architect." "Good man," Roman said it flatly, like a fact he'd verified and filed. "He's patient with her. Patient in a way that's genuine, not performed." "How do you know the difference?" Roman looked at her for a moment. "The same way you do." Claire's coffee arrived. She wrapped her hands around the cup. What did the other planning firms do wrong with Evelyn? The first one talked over her in the initial meeting. 3 minutes in, she looked at me and I knew we were done. He picked up his own cup. The second one sent a junior associate to the follow-up after Evelyn had already built a rapport with the lead designer. Evelyn took it as a signal that she wasn't worth the senior person's time. Was she right? Probably. He set the cup down. The third firm made everything beautiful and generic, like a very expensive hotel room that could belong to anyone. Claire nodded slowly. "What does Evelyn's aesthetic look like?" "She'll tell you better than I can, but warm, personal. She wants people to walk in and feel something specific that they couldn't feel anywhere else." He paused. "She grew up in places that were cold. She wants the opposite of that." Claire filed this away. Not just the detail, but the way he'd said it. She grew up in places that were cold, and the slight compression around his mouth when he'd said it, like the words had weight he wasn't fully releasing. "I'll need a meeting with Evelyn before I sign anything," Claire said. "I expected that, and I'll need full creative control within the scope we agree on. I'll take client feedback, but I don't take design direction from people who aren't designers." "Understood. If something's not working, I'll tell you directly. I don't soften professional assessments to make clients comfortable." Roman almost smiled. Not quite, but close, something at the corner of his mouth that came and went. "I'd be concerned if you did, last thing." Claire set her cup down. "I know who you are. I know what your name means in this city. I want to be clear that my involvement is professional and nothing else. Whatever you operate outside of these contracts doesn't come near my work, my team, or my studio." The almost smile disappeared. Roman looked at her steadily for a long moment. The cafe noise continued around them, the espresso machine, someone's chair scraping, a conversation at the counter. None of it seemed to reach the table. "The businesses associated with this contract are legitimate," he said. "Fully documented, auditable. I'm not asking you to participate in anything else, and I wouldn't. I'm not asking you to explain yourself. I'm telling you my boundary." I heard it. "Good." She pulled the contract toward her and read it in full, right there at the table. A sound like green wood splitting, while Roman waited without fidgeting or checking his phone or doing any of the things people typically do when they want to communicate that waiting is costing them something. He just waited, drank his coffee, looked out the window once. She reached the fee again at the bottom. "This is more than the market rate," she said. "Yes." "Why? Because the job is more complex than a standard event contract. The timeline is aggressive, and you'll be working under conditions that require additional discretion." He paused. "And because the work you did at the Meridian last night was worth more than what you billed for it." Claire looked up. "You saw my portfolio billing? I did some research this morning." "That's thorough." I'm a thorough person. She looked back at the contract, at the fee, at what it would mean for her studio, the equipment lease paid down, the outstanding invoice from the supplier settled, the breathing room to take on 2 additional projects in the spring without stretching her team past what was reasonable. She thought about Ethan's face. She pushed it away. This had nothing to do with Ethan. This was about her work. I'll meet with Evelyn, she said. If that meeting goes well, I'll sign. She's free Thursday. Thursday works. She folded the contract and put it in her bag. Roman flagged down the server and paid before she could offer, but he did it without making a production of it, just a quiet word, a card placed on the table. She decided not to argue about it this once. This was a preliminary meeting. She'd handle her own tab next time if there was a next time. Outside on the sidewalk, the October wind cut through. Claire buttoned her coat. Roman stood a few feet away, not crowding the space. Ms. Whitmore. She looked up. The man at the party, Roman said. Ethan Caldwell. She went very still. What about him? Nothing. He held her gaze. I just wanted to say that, whatever he thought he was communicating last night, he was wrong. She didn't answer right away. I know, she said finally. She walked to her car. She didn't look back, but she heard nothing behind her, no phone call, no conversation with his security. Just silence, which somehow carried more weight. Evelyn Mercer was not what Claire had prepared herself for. She'd constructed a mental image without meaning to, the younger sister of Roman Mercer, grown up in whatever world that meant, probably hard-edged in the way that people become when they've watched the people around them operate with sharp instruments. Guarded, maybe testing. The woman who walked into Claire's studio Thursday morning was 26 years old, wearing paint-stained jeans and carrying a folder so thick with magazine tear-outs and printed images that the rubber band holding it together had already cracked. She looked at the studio for a moment, the bolts of fabric, the cutting tables, the mood boards still pinned to the wall from Claire's last project, the industrial sewing machines and the smaller hand machines lined along the back shelf, and her whole face changed. This is an actual studio, Evelyn said. Not to Claire specifically, more to herself. What were you expecting? Claire asked. The last firm had a showroom. It looked like a very expensive dentist's office. Down. I'll make coffee. Evelyn sat. She opened her folder and then seemed to think better of it and closed it again. Can I ask you something first? Sure, Roman told me about the party. What happened with the guy, your ex? Claire turned from the coffee maker. He told you that? He said a man was rude to you and you didn't react and kept working. Evelyn looked at her steadily. I appreciated that he told me, because I need to know what kind of person I'm working with. How does that tell you what kind of person I am? Because the other option was making a scene or crying or leaving early, Evelyn said simply. All 3 of those would have meant you put your feelings in front of the job. You didn't. Claire poured the coffee, set a mug in front of Evelyn, sat down across from her. Your feelings matter, Claire said carefully. I'm not saying they don't. But you're right that the job is the job. I need someone who understands that, Evelyn said. Not someone who gets invested in my choices and starts pushing their vision instead of mine. I know what I want. Show me. Evelyn opened the folder. For the next 2 hours, Claire learned what Evelyn Mercer's wedding was supposed to feel like. Not look like, feel like. The distinction mattered enormously. The images Evelyn had accumulated were from a dozen different sources and didn't match each other stylistically, but they all carried the same temperature. Warm light, natural materials, nothing sharp, nothing cold. Tablecloths that looked like they'd been chosen by a person and not a catalog. You want it to feel inhabited, Claire said at one point. Evelyn looked up sharply. Yes, exactly that. Like people actually live in these spaces. The fabric choices will drive most of that. Color temperature, weave density, how the material behaves under candlelight versus electric. Claire pulled out her own notebook. I'm going to ask you some questions that might seem strange. Okay, what's the best meal you ever ate? Not the most expensive one. The best. Evelyn blinked. Then my grandmother's kitchen. She made pork dumplings on Sunday mornings. Her kitchen had this yellow curtain that turned the light gold when the sun came through. Claire wrote something down. What color do you think of when someone says the word home? Amber, or the color of old wood, honey maybe. Good. Last one. Claire looked up from the notebook. When you imagine the moment the reception doors open and you see it for the first time, what do you want to feel? Evelyn was quiet for a long time. Like someone made all of it specifically for me, she said. Not for a client, for me, Claire nodded slowly. I can do that, she said. She signed the contract that afternoon. The first 2 weeks were professional and nothing else. Claire arrived at Roman's event planning offices, a clean, modern floor in a building near the river, 3 times a week for planning sessions. She presented options. She sourced materials. She built a vendor coordination system that tracked 17 different suppliers across 6 weeks of a compressed timeline. Roman attended some of the sessions, not all of them. When he was there, he was precise and focused. He asked good questions, the kind of questions that revealed he'd actually read her materials beforehand, rather than expecting to be briefed in the room. He deferred to Evelyn on creative choices without being prompted to. He was also watching her. She knew it, not in the way that made her uncomfortable, in the way that means someone's paying attention and not disguising it. The 4th week, they ran into a supplier problem. The imported Venetian silk she'd sourced for the ceremony backdrop, 12 yards, a specific weight and weave that she'd specified precisely, and that represented 3 weeks of back and forth, with an Italian importer arrived damaged. A moisture issue in transit, most of it was unusable. She discovered it at 7 in the morning, in the warehouse where materials were being staged. She stood in front of the ruined fabric for a moment, said nothing. Then she called the importer. The importer told her the replacement timeline was 4 weeks minimum. She had 2.5 weeks to the event. She ended the call, stood in the warehouse, thought. Roman arrived at the warehouse at 8:15 for a scheduled check-in and found Claire already deep in her phone, cross-referencing domestic silk suppliers. She had 3 on-hold calls running and a list of 37 alternatives ranked by material similarity and delivery capacity. He looked at the ruined fabric spread on the table. Looked at Claire. How bad, he said. Bad enough. She didn't look up from her phone. Manageable. What do you need? I need you to not hover while I fix it. Pause. Then he stepped back. She was dimly aware of him moving to the far end of the warehouse, far enough to be out of her immediate space, close enough that she knew he was still there, which was she filed this away for later, not nothing. By noon, she had a solution, not the original fabric. A domestic alternative that required her to modify the backing application and adjust 2 of the color specifications she'd planned around the Venetian silk adjustments that would cost her approximately 40 hours of additional work, but that she was confident Evelyn wouldn't be able to distinguish from the original plan. The result would actually be slightly warmer in candlelight. She'd decided to see this as the outcome rather than the compromise. She explained all of this to Roman over lunch sandwiches from a place 2 blocks from the warehouse, eaten standing at the staging table, because neither of them had suggested anything else. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "You're not going to tell Evelyn there was a problem. I'm going to tell her. I made an adjustment to the backdrop material for better candlelight performance." Which is true. All of it is true. He picked up his sandwich, set it back down. Most people would have called me the second they found the fabric. Most people aren't trying to solve the problem. They're trying to distribute the panic. He looked at her for a moment with that same quality of attention she'd been cataloging for 4 weeks, the focused stillness that she'd initially read as calculation and had gradually come to understand was something different, flitting. It was the look of a man who spent most of his life in rooms where people were performing at him and had learned to recognize the difference between performance and the real thing. "Eat your lunch," Claire said. She picked up her own sandwich. He picked up his. That was the afternoon 6 weeks in when Claire realized the problem. Not the fabric problem, the other problem. A sound, the one that had been building in the background of every planning session and every warehouse meeting and every late-night email exchange where Roman's responses came back in under 4 minutes, regardless of the hour. She'd been treating it like weather. Background condition. Something moving in the periphery that you acknowledge without turning to face. She couldn't keep doing that. The following week, a meeting ran until 9:30 at night. Evelyn had needed to walk through the final floor plan 3 times before she felt settled, and the vendor coordinator had questions, and Claire had caught a mistake in the lighting contractor's installation schedule that required 20 minutes to untangle. By the time the offices cleared out, it was just Claire repacking her materials at the conference table, and Roman at the door of his adjoining office, jacket off, collar open, the particular kind of tired that comes from a day that required a different kind of vigilance than the one she used. "You found the lighting error," he said. "It would have meant the east wall was in shadow during the first dance." Evelyn would have noticed it in the photos for the rest of her life. My coordinator missed it. Your coordinator was managing 14 other line items. You were managing all of them. Claire looked up. Roman walked back to the conference table. He didn't sit. He stood across from her with his hands in his pockets and looked at her with an expression she couldn't categorize, which was becoming a pattern where Roman Mercer was concerned. I want to say something, he said. Then say it. I'm aware that my name carries a specific set of implications in this city. He said it, without softening it, without cushioning it. I'm not going to pretend otherwise or expect you to ignore it. Claire put her notebook in her bag. Why are you telling me this right now? Because I think you should know that what you see in these rooms, the way I work, the way I treat the people in these rooms, that's not a performance. It's not a different version of me for your benefit. She looked at him steadily. What is it then? It's me deciding what I want my life to look like. A pause. Or deciding that I want to have the kind of life that's worth deciding about. Conference room was quiet. The building had that particular late evening quality where the ventilation sounds louder because everything else has stopped. That's a complicated thing to say to someone you hired 6 weeks ago, Claire said. I know. It puts me in a position. I know that too. She pulled her bag strap over her shoulder, looked at him. He was, and she registered this without wanting to because it was inconvenient not looking away. Roman. It was the first time she'd used his name directly. She saw him register it. The wedding is in 2 weeks, she said. We finish the job. We see how everything lands. And then we have a conversation that isn't inside a business context. He held her gaze. Okay, I'm not saying yes to anything. I heard you. I'm saying let me finish what I started. He nodded once. The same way he agreed to things when the agreement was real rather than polite. She walked to the elevator. Behind her, she heard him say her name once. Just her name. Nothing attached to it. She pressed the button and waited. The doors opened. She stepped inside. As they closed, she had exactly enough time to understand that she was no longer standing at the edge of something she could choose to step back from. She was already in it, and somewhere underneath the professional caution and the self-protective instinct and the very reasonable list of reasons why this was complicated somewhere, beneath all of that, Claire Whitmore was not sorry. The 2 weeks before Evelyn's wedding were the most technically demanding of Claire's professional life. Not because anything went catastrophically wrong, because everything required her full attention simultaneously, and full attention is a finite resource that doesn't stretch without cost. She was running on 6 hours of sleep on a good night, 4 on a bad one. Her shoulder, which had mostly stopped hurting, started hurting again around day 10. She kept a bottle of ibuprofen in her bag and stopped counting how many she was taking. Marcus told her twice that she looked like she was running a fever. She wasn't. She was just running. The modified backdrop silk arrived from the domestic supplier on a Tuesday and was better than she'd expected. The weight was right. The weave close enough to the original specification that only someone who'd handled both would notice the difference. She stayed in the studio until 2 in the morning Tuesday night, cutting and preparing the panels herself rather than delegating it, because this was the piece she'd promised. Evelyn would feel like it was made specifically for her, and that promise was going to be kept by Claire's own hands, or not at all. Wednesday, she was back at the event space by 7 to supervise the first phase of installation. Roman came by at noon. He didn't interfere. He walked the room, looked at the work in progress, asked 2 logistical questions about vendor access on the day of the event, and then stood near the east wall for a few minutes, watching Claire direct the team rigging the ceiling fabric channels. She knew he was watching. She kept working. At one point, their eyes met across the room, just briefly, just the acknowledgement of 2 people who'd said something true to each other recently and hadn't yet had the space to determine what it meant. Then she looked back at the rigging. Then he left. She didn't have time for the other thing yet. She'd told him that. He'd agreed to it. She was going to hold both of them to it until the wedding was done and she could think in a straight line again. Thursday brought a problem with the centerpiece vendor, a miscommunication about delivery windows that required Claire to spend 90 minutes on the phone working out a revised schedule while simultaneously proving the final color corrections on the table runners. She handled it. She always handled it. But handling it took something out of her that she couldn't immediately put back. Friday, 3 days before the event, Evelyn came to the space for the first preview walkthrough. Claire had prepared for this. She'd staged a single completed Section 2 tables, the nearest section of the backdrop, the overhead fabric installation at half completion, so Evelyn could see the direction without seeing everything. Evelyn walked in and stopped. She stood there for a long moment without saying anything. Claire waited. She'd learned in the Thursday meeting that Evelyn processed things at her own pace, and that rushing that process produced worse results for everyone. "It's warm," Evelyn said finally. That was the goal. Evelyn pressed her lips together. She turned around once, slowly, taking in the incomplete room. "It looks like someone actually thought about me." Someone did. Evelyn looked at her. Then she laughed, not a polished laugh, a real one, slightly startled. "I didn't cry at any of the other previews. Don't cry yet. It's not finished, I know. She stopped. Composed herself with some effort. "Daniel's going to lose it when he sees this." "Good, that's what it's for." Evelyn walked the section again, slower. She stopped at one of the tables, touched the fabric of the runner, the amber gold weave that Claire had developed specifically after their conversation about gold curtains and Sunday mornings. Evelyn ran her fingers along it without looking up. "Roman told me something," Evelyn said. Claire waited. "He told me you turned down a larger contract last month to keep your schedule clear for this." Claire kept her expression level. "It wasn't the right project. He said it was significantly larger." "It wasn't the right project," Claire repeated. Evelyn looked up. She had Roman's eyes, that same quality of focus, the same refusal to accept surface answers. "Why? Because I committed to your wedding. Because Evelyn Mercer deserves a designer whose attention is here, not split across 2 jobs." She paused. "And because the other project was for someone I don't particularly want to help succeed." Evelyn tilted her head slightly. "Who?" Claire met her eyes. "Ethan Caldwell." The name landed in the room. Evelyn's expression shifted, not surprise exactly. Something more like recognition. "He contacted your studio?" "His fiancée's events coordinator did. They're planning the engagement party. It's a significant contract." Claire looked at the fabric on the table. "I declined." "Does Roman know?" "It's not Roman's business." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "He'd want to know." "Maybe, but it's still not his business." Claire moved to the next table. "Come look at this section." The conversation shifted back to the work. Evelyn had questions, good questions, the kind that revealed she'd been thinking carefully of the space rather than just reacting to it. Claire answered them directly. They worked through the remaining open items on the design plan together, Evelyn deferring on technical choices while holding firm on the emotional ones, which was exactly the right division of authority. When Evelyn left, she hugged Claire at the door, briefly, and with the slightly awkward sincerity of someone who doesn't hug casually. "Thank you," Evelyn said. 3 more days, Claire said. "Save it for after." Saturday night, 2 days before the wedding, Claire was alone in the event space. The rest of the team had left at 8. Claire had stayed to handle a final check on the backdrop installation, which had developed a slight tension problem in the upper left channel that was invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for it, and completely obvious to her. She was up on a stepladder at the far end of the room, working a fabric channel back into correct alignment, when she heard the door open. She looked down. It wasn't Roman. It wasn't one of the venue staff. It was Ethan Caldwell. He was in a sport coat and open-collar shirt, casual, deliberately so, the kind of casual that requires effort. He looked around the room as he came in, taking in the near-complete installation with an expression that moved through several things quickly: surprise, appraisal, then something more complicated. Claire did not get off the ladder immediately. She finished what she was doing, both hands on the fabric channel, working the tension to even. She took 30 more seconds because the job needed 30 more seconds, and not because she was making a point, though she was aware it probably read as both. Then she came down. "This is a private event space," she said. "The venue is closed to non-staff." "I know." Ethan stopped 10 feet from the base of the ladder. "I know the hotel manager. He let me in." "Then you can ask the hotel manager to let you back out." "Claire." He said her name the way he used to, when he wanted her to slow down, a specific tone, half appeal and half command, something she'd spent 2 years responding to before she understood what she was responding to. "I just want to talk." "We're not in a talking situation, Ethan." 5 minutes. She set the ladder to the side, picked up her kit bag, started moving toward the supply table at the edge of the room, because the supply table was where she needed to go, not because she was moving away from him, even though she was also doing that. "I saw you with Roman Mercer," Ethan said. She didn't stop moving. "At the engagement party. I saw you come in with him." His voice was following her across the room. "Claire." Do you understand who that man is? She set the kit bag on the supply table, started going through it for the tension tool she needed for tomorrow. Claire, this isn't someone you should be involved with. Whatever he's told you about himself, whatever he's. Ethan. She found the tool, placed it aside for tomorrow. You don't get to be concerned about me. I'm not concerned. He stopped. She heard him exhale. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, which was the version she used to find harder to resist. I made a mistake 3 years ago. I know I did. She turned around. He looked the same, slightly better dressed now, the way people look when money has had time to settle onto them. But the face was the same one she'd known for 4 years, and there was something genuinely uncomfortable in it. Right now, not performed discomfort. Real, that was somehow worse. You texted me, she said. 4 years. You sent me a text. I know. The suit you wore to the interview that got you into Harrington's circle, I altered that suit 3 times. I know, Claire, you're wearing a better one now. He said nothing. What do you want, she said. I want, he stopped. Ran a hand through his hair, which he used to do when he was trying to find the version of a sentence that would land the way he needed it to. I want you to be careful. Mercer is dangerous. The people around him are dangerous. Whatever he's offering you, he offered me a professional contract, and he honored the terms of it. That's how it starts. Don't. The word came out harder than she intended. She didn't soften it. Don't come in here and tell me how things start. You don't know anything about how my last 6 weeks have gone, and you certainly don't get to have opinions about my professional decisions. I'm not talking about professional decisions. The room went very quiet. Ethan looked at her with an expression that she recognized and didn't want to because she remembered being moved by it once, back when it was directed at her without conditions. He's not right for you, Ethan said. Something cold and clear moved through Claire's chest. You're engaged, she said. I know. You're engaged to another woman, and you're standing in my workspace at 9 o'clock at night telling me another man isn't right for me. She held his gaze. Do you hear yourself? The discomfort in his face deepened. She saw the thing underneath it now, the calculation she'd missed for 4 years because she'd been too busy loving him to look for it. He wasn't here out of concern. He wasn't here out of guilt. He was here because seeing her with Roman Mercer at the engagement party had destabilized something in him, and he'd come to restabilize it. He needed her to be exactly where he'd left her. He needed her to still be the thing he'd discarded, not the thing someone else had recognized. Leave, Claire said. Claire, we're done here. We were done 3 years ago. Leave the venue. He stood there for another moment. The expression shifted the discomfort, hardening into something thinner and less honest. Think he's different, Ethan said. You think because he's powerful and he treats you well right now that makes him different. Men like that don't change. They move through people. She looked at him without blinking, like you did. The thin expression cracked. She turned back to the supply table. I'm going to keep working now. You need to go. She heard him stand there for another 15 seconds. She counted them. She didn't mean to, but she counted them, and then she heard his footsteps cross the room and the door open and close. She kept her hands flat on the supply table, breathed in, breathed out. Then she picked up her checklist and kept working. She didn't call Roman that night. She thought about it, decided against it. This wasn't something Roman needed to know about before the wedding, and it wasn't something she wanted to process through someone else anyway. She'd process it herself in the morning after sleep. She left the venue at 10:30, drove home, fed her dog, stood in her kitchen, and ate leftover rice standing at the counter because she was too tired to sit down. Then she went to bed. Evelyn's wedding was on a Monday. Claire arrived at 6 in the morning. By 11, the room was complete. She stood at the center of it, the way she'd stood in the center of every finished job, not with satisfaction exactly, more with the particular stillness of a person who has expended everything they had on something and is now looking at the result and taking its measure honestly. It was the best work she'd ever done. She knew it the way she knew when fabric was wrong, instinctively, without having to argue herself into it. Every element of the room carried Evelyn's specific emotional temperature. The amber gold ran through the whole space, like a thread in the tablecloths, in the overhead fabric channels that diffused the chandelier light into something honey-warm, in the accent panels along the walls that shifted between deep ochre and pale cream, depending on where you stood. It felt inhabited. It felt like someone had made it specifically for one person. Roman walked in at 11:15. He stopped inside the doorway, stood there. She watched him look at the room. A sound like green wood splitting. Watched the controlled stillness of his face encounter, something it didn't immediately have a response for, something that moved through his expression briefly, like light across water, and then settled. Evelyn's going to cry, he said. I told her not to yet. She's not going to be able to help it. He walked further into the room. A sound like green wood splitting, stopped beside the central table arrangement and looked at the fabric runner, the amber gold piece, the one that had started with a conversation about a grandmother's kitchen and a yellow curtain. You made this work feel like her, he said. That was the job. No, he looked at her. The job was a wedding with custom fabrics and decor coordination. This is something else. She held his gaze. Ethan Caldwell came to the venue Saturday night, she said. Roman went very still. The quality of stillness changed. It was no longer the controlled calm she'd learned to read as his baseline. It was the stillness of a man whose body has received information and is deciding what to do with it before any visible response. What did he want? Roman said. Not a question, a flat sentence. To warn me about you. She kept her voice even. And to see if I was still in a position he could manage. Did he touch you? No. Did he threaten you? He was, she considered the word, destabilized. Seeing us together at the party did something to his self-image that he hadn't resolved. Roman looked at her for a long moment. She could see the thing moving behind his eyes, whatever response his instinct was producing, and she could see him hold it. I should have, he started. No, she said. You shouldn't have done anything. I handled it. I'm telling you because you should know, not because I need you to respond to it. He held her gaze. Something moved through his face. Okay, he said. Okay, she repeated. They stood in the completed room together for a moment, the amber light. The fabric moving faintly in the air conditioning, the whole space waiting to be inhabited by the people it had been made for. After today, Roman said. After today, Claire agreed. She went back to work. Evelyn cried when she saw the room. She managed to hold it together for approximately 40 seconds after the doors opened, and then she put one hand over her mouth, and the other hand reached back blindly and found Daniel's arm. And she cried without making a sound, while Daniel looked at the room over her shoulder, with an expression that Claire saw from across the space and filed away as the specific face of a man who has just fully understood something. Claire was near the service entrance. She watched. She didn't intrude. Marcus appeared beside her. Yeah, he said quietly. We did that. We did, Claire said. The ceremony was at 4. By 7, the reception was running with the self-contained momentum of an event that has been built correctly, where every structurally reinforces every other structural decision, and the whole thing holds its own weight without constant intervention. Claire's team moved through the room, making invisible adjustments. She watched from the margins, tracking everything. At 8:15, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. It was a message from a number she didn't recognize. But the name attached to it, a name that had been saved in her phone years ago and then never deleted, lingering the way some things do, told her who had gotten access to this number and why. Vanessa Harrington, we need to talk. Tonight if possible. It's important. Claire read it twice. Then she put her phone back in her pocket and finished the reception. She told herself it could wait. She told herself whatever Vanessa Harrington wanted to discuss could be addressed in the morning, after a night's sleep, after the invoice was filed and the team was debriefed, and she had recovered something of her equilibrium. She told herself that until 10:45, when Vanessa sent a second message. It's about Roman, please. They met in a hotel bar 2 blocks from the venue. Not the Grand Meridian. A quieter place, half empty at this hour, the kind of bar that caters to people who need to have conversations they don't want overheard. Vanessa was already there when Claire arrived. She was still in her party clothes, a dark red dress, pearl earrings, but the composed surface that Claire had observed at the engagement party had developed cracks. Not obvious ones, the kind you see when you're looking for them. She was nursing a glass of white wine she'd barely touched. Claire sat down. I'll be direct, she said. Vanessa nodded like that was the version she'd been hoping for. What's this about? Vanessa wrapped both hands around her wine glass. She looked at Claire with the expression of someone who has rehearsed what they're about to say and has now, in the actual moment, lost confidence in the rehearsal. Ethan came home Saturday night and told me he'd been to see you, she said. Claire waited. He said it was to warn you. About Roman Mercer. Vanessa's jaw tightened slightly. I know why he really went. The bar was quiet enough that Claire could hear the ice in a glass at the next table. Then you know more than I do, Claire said carefully. No, Vanessa looked at her. I think you know exactly why he went. I think you've always known what Ethan is like, better than I do. You spent 4 years with him. Why are you here, Vanessa? The other woman exhaled slowly, set the wine glass down, looked at it. Because there's something you need to know about Roman Mercer, she said. Something I found out, something Ethan found out, because of a business connection between my father and one of Mercer's operations. Claire felt something shift in her chest, quiet and cold. My father has been in a business arrangement with one of Roman Mercer's holding companies for 8 months, Vanessa said. On paper it looks clean, consulting fees, real estate facilitation. But 3 weeks ago, my father's attorney found documentation suggesting the arrangement had been used without my father's full knowledge to move funds through 3 shell accounts in a way that my father's attorney describes as she stopped, pressed her lips together. Significantly problematic. Problematic how? Potentially criminal. Vanessa met her eyes. The kind of criminal that doesn't stay contained. Kind that reaches everything connected to it. The room felt smaller. My father is 71 years old, Vanessa said. He's done things in his life I'm not proud of, but he didn't sign off on this. He didn't know. Her voice was steady and fraying simultaneously, the way a rope looks before the last thread goes. And if this comes out, when this comes out, it takes everything. His reputation, the family company, Ethan's career, because Ethan's career exists because of the Harrington name. Claire sat very still. Why are you telling me this? Her voice was controlled. She was controlling it with effort. Because you're involved with him. Vanessa's eyes were direct. Because I think you're a person who makes decisions based on real information. And because Ethan's version of warning you was to go to your workplace and say whatever served his own purposes. And I thought she stopped. I thought you deserved the actual facts. How long have you known about this? 3 days. Have you spoken to Roman? No. My father's attorney has advised us not to contact Mercer directly until the legal situation is clearer. Claire looked at the table, at the wood grain, at nothing. She had built 6 weeks of professional trust on a foundation she had personally verified. She had checked the contract. She had confirmed the legitimate business structures. She had drawn a line and been told, to her face, that the line would be respected. The businesses associated with this contract are legitimate, fully documented, auditable. I'm not asking you to participate in anything else, and I wouldn't. She heard the words in his voice. She heard the quality of them, the particular register of a man saying something he intended to be true. And she genuinely, carefully, honestly did not know whether that made the information Vanessa had just given her better or worse. I need to see the documentation, Claire said. Vanessa blinked. What? The documentation your father's attorney found. I'm not going to make decisions about my life based on a second-hand account of a legal assessment from a source with an obvious interest in my conclusions. She met Vanessa's eyes. If what you're saying is accurate, I'll deal with it. But I'm going to look at the actual evidence. Vanessa was quiet for a moment. Then she reached into her bag and set a folded document on the table between them. My father's attorney prepared a summary, she said. I made a copy. Claire looked at the folded pages. She picked them up. She read. The bar noise continued around her glasses, low conversation, the television in the corner showing something with the sound off. She read the document twice, methodically, the way she read contracts, without letting her emotional response get ahead of the information. When she finished, she folded it, set it down, sat with it for a moment. The document was real. The shell account structure described was real. The holding company named in the summary, not Mercer Holdings LLC, but a subsidiary 2 layers removed. A name she'd never seen in any paperwork she'd signed was real. And Roman Mercer's name appeared in the chain, not as a signatory, not as the direct instrument, but present in the chain in a way that suggested knowledge if not authorization, proximity if not proof. He thought about the warehouse. The businesses associated with this contract are legitimate. She thought about the conference room. At 11 o'clock at night, his jacket off, collar open, telling her that what she saw in those rooms was not a performance. She thought about the room she had just spent 6 weeks building for his sister. The amber gold light, the fabric that felt inhabited, the way Evelyn had cried and reached back for Daniel's arm. She thought about her studio, her name on the contract, the documented, auditable, legitimate investment he'd proposed not yet signed, because they'd agreed to wait until after the wedding because she'd needed the job to be finished and clean before she allowed the other thing to begin. She had not yet signed. She was still technically only a vendor, but the investment proposal sat in a folder in her studio desk, fully drafted, waiting for her signature. And if Roman Mercer's financial structures were being investigated for criminal facilitation, then her name on that document, on anything connected to his companies, put her in a position that she could not recover from professionally. Not a woman trying to build something from scratch. Not a woman who had no inherited safety net, no wealthy family, no name that could absorb the impact. Not Claire Whitmore. She stood up. "Thank you," she said to Vanessa. And she meant it not warmly, not gratefully, but honestly. The information was real. She'd rather have it than not. Vanessa looked up at her. "What are you going to do?" Claire picked up her bag. "I'm going to find out what's true," she said. She walked out of the bar into the cold night air. Her phone was in her hand. Roman's contact was on the screen. Her thumb hovered. She stood on the sidewalk with the Chicago wind cutting through her coat and the city noise moving around her and the weight of 6 weeks of work and something that had been growing quietly underneath. The work pressing against the inside of her chest. She had one question. She needed one honest answer. And she had no way of knowing, not yet, not standing here whether the man who had caught her in the dark and asked, "Are you hurt before anything else?" was the kind of man who was capable of giving it. Called him. 3 rings. 4. She was about to pull the phone from her ear when he picked up. Claire. Just her name. No surprise in it. No sleep. He was still awake. Wherever he was, and he'd seen her name on the screen and answered it with that particular quality of attention she'd come to recognize as specifically his. "I need to see you," she said tonight. A pause. "Not long. Where are you?" She gave him the cross streets. He told her not to move. She stood on the sidewalk for 9 minutes in the October cold. Her coat buttoned wrong, she noticed it and didn't fix it, and the folded document from Vanessa's attorney sitting in her bag like something radioactive. Car that pulled up was dark and unremarkable. Roman was in the back. He opened the door from the inside. She got in. The driver pulled away immediately, no direction given, which meant Roman had told him to drive and keep driving, the kind of instruction that buys a private conversation on wheels. She registered this. She registered everything, right now, with the heightened clarity of a person whose system is running too fast. Roman looked at her in the low light of the moving car. He looked at her face, and whatever he saw there made him go very still. "Talk to me," he said. She reached into her bag, took out the folded document, held it out. He took it, opened it, read it. She watched his face while he read. She'd decided on the sidewalk that this was how she would do it, that she would watch his face with the same attention he'd been directing at her for 6 weeks, and she would take in whatever was true and deal with it. He read the whole thing without speaking. His expression didn't collapse or harden. A sound like green wood splitting. It did something more specific. It moved through something, a sequence of internal recognition she couldn't fully translate, and then it settled into something that was not the face of a man encountering a surprise. She felt that settle in her chest like cold water. "You know what this is," she said. Not a question. He folded the document, held it, looked at the back of the driver's seat. "Yes," he said. The car moved through an intersection. The city lights slid across the windows. "Tell me," Claire said. He looked at her. Kellerman Capital, the subsidiary named in that summary. "I used it 8 months ago to facilitate a real estate transaction that involved," he stopped. Chose the next words carefully. "Money that was not cleanly sourced." The directness of it hit her differently than she'd expected. She'd prepared for deflection, for the practiced smoothness of a man who'd spent his life managing information. She hadn't prepared for this, for a man who looked at her and gave her the sentence without softening it. "Richard Harrington," she said. He knew what the arrangement was when he entered it. The documentation your contact's attorney prepared it frames him as uninformed. He wasn't uninformed. "That's not my concern right now." Her voice was controlled. She was gripping it with both hands. "My concern is that I have an unsigned investment agreement from Mercer Holdings LLC sitting in my desk, and my name has been connected to your companies through a 6-week public contract, and if any of what's in that document becomes a legal proceeding, it won't reach you. You don't know that, Claire. You told me the businesses associated with our contract were legitimate." The word "told" came out harder than she'd planned. "You told me, in that conference room. You looked me in the face, and they are legitimate. Every company you've contracted with is clean. What's in that document is 2 layers removed from anything you've touched. 2 layers, she heard her own voice, flat. 2 layers is not nothing. 2 layers is not what you described when you said the word legitimate to me. He held her gaze. She watched him absorb this, not neglect it. Absorb it, the way someone takes a hit they know they earned. No, he said, it's not. The car stopped at a light. Couple crossed in front of them, laughing at something. One of them stumbling slightly. Normal city, normal night. The kind of night that has no idea what is happening in a parked car at a red light. Did you know? Claire said. When you offered me the investment, did you know this was out there? He looked at her. Yes, he said. She stopped breathing for a second. I believed it was contained, he said. I believed the structure was solid enough that… Stop. She held up one hand. Stop explaining why you thought it was okay. That's not an answer to what I asked you. He stopped. She looked at the window, at the city going by, at nothing. You knew there was a liability connected to your financial structure, and you presented me with an investment proposal anyway, she said, without disclosing it. Yes. While telling me everything was documented and legitimate. The investment self, Roman. His name came out like a closed door. He stopped again. She turned to look at him. She looked at him fully, the way she hadn't allowed herself to in 6 weeks of professional proximity, taking him in without the buffer of the work, without the ongoing task to redirect her attention. She looked at the face she'd been cataloging since the ascent, in night the dark ballroom. The scar below his ear. The eyes that had been paying attention to her since the first moment. I built something with you, she said. 6 weeks. I built not just the wedding. I built… She stopped. Felt the thing she'd been keeping below the surface, pressing up, held it. I need to know if I was building with someone real or someone who was managing me. The silence in the car was different from the silences she'd navigated all night. This one had weight, volume, the kind of silence that is actually full of something. Roman leaned forward, put his elbows on his knees, put the document down on the seat. When he spoke, his voice was lower. Everything I said to you in those rooms was true, he said. Every word. The way I see you. The way I talked about Evelyn. The investment my intention was… He stopped. Started again. My intention was that nothing would ever reach you. I built the offer to be clean. I believed it was clean enough. But you knew there was risk. There's always risk in my world. Not in mine. Her voice broke on the last word, not loudly. A hairline fracture. She pressed through it. I don't have a backup. I don't have a family name that survives a scandal. I have my studio and my work and my name on my own building, and if my name gets attached to a criminal investigation, even tangentially, even 2 layers removed, it's finished. All of it. Everything I spent 3 years building after you. She stopped. She hadn't meant to say after you, meaning Ethan, meaning the text message, meaning the 4 years and the suit and the 3A. Presentation revisions. She hadn't meant to let that in, but it was in. Roman looked at her. She saw the moment he understood what she'd almost said and chose not to address it directly, which was the right choice, and she registered that he made it. What do you need from me, he said. The question landed differently than she expected. Not what do you want me to do? Not how do I fix this? What do you need? Like a man who understood the distinction. She pressed her hands flat on her thighs, steadied herself. I need to know if the legal exposure is real, she said. Not your assessment. A real attorney. Someone with no connection to your operations. I'll arrange it tomorrow morning, tonight. He looked at her. I'm not sleeping tonight anyway, she said. And I'm not making decisions with a 12-hour gap in between. Tonight, he reached for his phone. The attorney's name was Sandra Voss. She had an office in the Loop, and the particular manner of someone who had been woken up by important phone calls enough times that she'd stopped being surprised by them. She arrived 20 minutes after Roman's call, in a coat over what were clearly pajama pants tucked into boots, which somehow made Claire trust her more. She read the document. She asked Claire 4 direct questions about the contracts she'd signed and the payment structures she'd engaged with through Mercer Holdings. Claire answered each one precisely. Sandra Voss set down her pen. Your contracts are clean, she said. The work you performed was through a legitimate entity. The subsidiary named in this document has no direct connection to the agreements you've signed. She paused. The unsigned investment proposal, don't sign it. Not yet. Not until the Kellerman situation resolves. How long does that take? Depends on whether federal attention materializes. If it does, months minimum. If the Harrington family attorney makes a strategic move, possibly faster. And my existing contracts? My public association with Mercer Holdings? You're a vendor. You produced a service. Vendors are rarely named in financial investigations involving subsidiaries 2 layers removed. She looked at Claire directly. I'm not saying there's zero risk. I'm saying the risk to you specifically is low, provided you don't sign anything new until the landscape is clearer. Claire sat with this for a moment. Then she nodded. Sandra Voss packed up her documents. She shook Claire's hand, gave Roman a look that communicated several things without using words, and left. Roman and Claire were alone in the conference room he'd arranged, not his own office. A neutral space, another building, which she'd noted and appreciated, even through everything else. He stood by the window. She sat at the table. The investment, she said. I'm not signing it, I know. Not yet, maybe not at all, depending on how this resolves. Claire, the professional relationship is complete. The wedding is done. I'll file the final invoice this week and close out the vendor account. He turned from the window. And everything else, she said. What I told you in that conference room 3 weeks ago after today, we talk. She stopped. I need time. I need to think I need to not be inside this situation while I figure out how I feel about it. Roman looked at her across the conference table. He looked at her the way he'd been looking at her since an amber-lit ballroom 4 weeks ago, with the full force of his attention, not performing patience, just using it. How much time, he said. I don't know. Okay, that's all you're going to say. What would you like me to say? She didn't have an answer to that. She looked at the table. I'm not punishing you. I need to be clear about that. This is not a performance of anger. I'm genuinely trying to figure out the line between who you are and what your world does. They're not always separable, he said. I know, she met his eyes. That's the problem. He held her gaze. She saw something move in his face, not the composed surface or the careful stillness. Something underneath. The thing the composed surface was built to protect. Showing through for a moment, the way the structure of a building shows through the drywall when you know where to look. I should have told you, he said, about the liability. Before the investment proposal. I should have told you. I didn't because I believed I could protect you from it. He stopped. Which is what I told myself. I don't know how much of it was also about not wanting to lose He stopped again. She waited. Your good opinion of me, he said. The sentence was quiet and unguarded in a way none of his sentences had been, and she sat with it. Go home, she said finally. Not harshly. Let me think. He nodded once. He picked up his jacket, moved toward the door. Roman. He stopped. Tonight in the car, when I asked if you knew. She looked at him. Thank you for not lying. He held her gaze for one moment. Then he left. She sat alone in the conference room for a long time. She slept 4 hours and woke up with the problem, still, exactly where she'd left it, which was how she'd known it was real. The things that survive sleep are the things that actually matter. She made coffee, fed her dog, sat at her kitchen table with the unsigned investment proposal in front of her and her laptop open to her studio's financial statements. She looked at the numbers. She knew them by heart, but she looked at them again because she needed to see them without the filter of the last 6 weeks, when Roman's presence had made them feel less urgent. Studio was surviving. That was the honest word. Surviving, not thriving. The wedding contract had stabilized the immediate cash position, but the equipment lease was still heavy. The supplier invoice still outstanding, and her expansion timeline was still measured in years rather than months. She'd known this before Roman Mercer. She'd been living inside this math for 3 years. It was not new information. What was new was what it felt like to know it now, when the alternative, the route that would have changed the math, was sitting unsigned on the table, because accepting it required trusting a man who had withheld something she needed to know. She closed the investment proposal. She opened her email. There were 14 unread messages. 3 were from clients. 1 was from Marcus, sent at 11:15 the night before. Heard from Priya, the wedding went amazingly. You okay? She typed back, I'm okay. Talk tomorrow. Closed the laptop. She was not, technically, okay. She was functional, which she had learned over the years was a different category. Functional meant she could perform the tasks the day required. It did not mean the thing moving around her chest like a stone in a jar had resolved itself. She trusted Roman's word when he spoke directly to her. That was the part she couldn't dismiss, no matter how much it would have been convenient to. She also could not dismiss what she'd read in that document. Not the legal risk. Sandra Voss had assessed that clearly, but what it revealed about the space between Roman's stated intentions and the actual structure of his world. The two-layer gap between legitimate and clean. The assumption that he could build up between what he was and what touched her, without asking her whether she wanted a wall or the truth. Ethan had assumed things about her too. Different things with different consequences. But the shape of it, the shape of a man, deciding what Claire needed to know about the life they were building, had a familiar outline. She sat with that. She turned it over. She was careful not to equate the two men, because the equation wasn't accurate. Ethan had made decisions out of contempt. Roman had made a decision out of something that might have been protectiveness, or might have been fear, or might have been both, and she couldn't be certain which it was, and the uncertainty was the point. She was still sitting at the kitchen table when her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Not Roman, not Marcus, Evelyn. She picked up. "I know it's early," Evelyn said. "I've been up since 5. I'm on my way to the airport. Daniel and I are leaving for Italy this morning." "Evelyn, you don't need to call. I want to." A pause. "I heard something last night. One of Roman's people. I overheard a conversation I wasn't supposed to hear." Her voice was measured, deliberate, the Mercer quality of choosing words like a person who understands their weight. "I know about the Harrington situation." Claire's grip on the phone tightened slightly. "He told you?" she said. "No. Like I said, I overheard." Another pause. "Claire, I know my brother. I know the world he came from and the things he's done to survive it. I'm not asking you to excuse any of it, but I want to tell you something. Go ahead. In 15 years, I have never seen Roman Mercer build something the way he's been building things for the last 6 weeks. Not a deal, not an arrangement, something." A pause. "He changed the meeting schedule around your calendar. Did he tell you that? He had 3 standing commitments on Tuesday mornings, and he moved all of them after you told him 11 instead of 10 at that first coffee." Claire closed her eyes briefly. "Evelyn, I'm not lobbying for him. He'd hate that I was calling. I'm just giving you information. Because you gave me the most beautiful day of my life yesterday, and I think you deserve to make whatever decision you're making with all the information that exists. A beat. Not just the bad parts." Claire sat with this. "Thank you," she said. "I have a plane to catch." The warmth in Evelyn's voice was genuine and slightly awkward, the same way her hug at the studio door had been genuine and slightly awkward. Real. Take care of yourself. The call ended. Claire put the phone down. She looked at her kitchen, at the coffee going cold, the dog asleep in the corner on a bed she'd bought second-hand, and reinforced herself because the stitching was coming apart. She thought about Roman moving 3 Tuesday commitments. She thought about what do you need instead of how do I fix it. She thought about a man choosing to answer yes when he could have said almost anything else and made it harder for her to pin down. Then she thought about the document, about 2 layers removed, about the shape of a world that had edges she couldn't see from where she was standing. She was not naive. She was not building a fantasy. She understood what Roman Mercer was, and she'd understood it from the moment she heard his name in the hotel corridor. She'd walked into that coffee meeting with open eyes, and she intended to keep them open. The question was not who he had been. The question was whether what she'd seen in those rooms, in 6 weeks of close proximity and late nights and hard conversations, was real enough to stand on. She didn't have the answer yet, but she knew, sitting in her kitchen in the early morning light, that she was going to have to find it herself, with no one else making the decision for her. Not Vanessa, not Evelyn, not the unsigned document or the financial statements or the memory of Ethan's face when he'd walked into her workspace and decided she needed warning. She got up, poured the cold coffee out, made a fresh cup. Then she got dressed and went to her studio because there was work to do, and work was still the thing she could trust completely. She was at the cutting table at 8:15 when the studio door opened. Not Marcus. He had a key, but he knocked. This was someone who had tried the door and found it unlocked. She looked up. Richard Harrington was 68, not 71 Vanessa had been rounding up, maybe out of exhaustion, and in person he was shorter than his public profile suggested. The kind of man who photographed powerful and stood in rooms as something more complicated. A sound like was cashmere, and he was sweating, slightly inside it, which told her he'd come directly and hadn't thought through the climate between the car and the studio. He looked at the cutting table, at her, at the studio. "Ms. Whitmore," he said. She put down the shears. "Mr. Harrington, you're in my studio without an appointment." "I know. I apologize." He didn't look apologetic. He looked like a man who was running a calculation and had decided that direct was the fastest route. 10 minutes. You've already used 2 of them. He stepped further into the studio, looked at the fabric bolts, the work surfaces, the organized precision of the space. He was assessing. She let him. Because she knew what he was looking at. He was looking at the size of what she had and deciding what kind of leverage existed. She'd seen that calculation before, on smaller men. "My daughter spoke to you last night," he said. "She did. She shouldn't have. That's between you and Vanessa." He turned to look at her directly. Up close, the sweat was visible at his temple. "What I need from you is simple. The document Vanessa gave you the summary from my attorney, I need it back. And I need your assurance that its contents go no further." Claire looked at him. "Why would I assure you of anything?" she said. "I'm a textile designer. I don't have a stake in your legal situation. You have a stake in your relationship with Roman Mercer, which is what connects you to my legal situation." He said it flatly, not cruelly. The tone of a man presenting a business reality. If the Kellerman arrangement becomes a matter of public record, everything connected to it becomes scrutinized, including a 6-week public contract between a Mercer-affiliated event company and Claire Whitmore Textile Design. My attorney has assessed that risk. Your attorney assessed it based on current visibility. Visibility changes when federal attention increases. He let that settle. "I'm not threatening you. I'm telling you the landscape. You're doing both," she said. "You've decided they're the same thing." He blinked. Fractional. Not what he'd expected her to say. "What do you want, Mr. Harrington?" she said. "Not the document. You can get a copy from your own attorney. What are you actually asking me to do?" He looked at her for a moment. Recalibrating. "Roman Mercer will not walk away from the Kellerman liability cleanly," he said. "His name is in the chain. That doesn't dissolve because he structured things carefully. When this moves, and it will move, he'll need to redirect attention. He'll offer something to make the exposure smaller." He paused. "He'll offer someone." The room felt very still. "You think he'll use me?" she said. "I think he'll use whatever is available to him." Harrington's voice wasn't vicious. It was almost tired. The voice of a man who'd been in enough rooms to have lost his illusions about other men. "I'm telling you this because my daughter genuinely believes she was helping you last night. And because I'd rather you hear it from me than from a federal attorney in 18 months. Claire stood behind her cutting table. She looked at Richard Harrington at the sweat and the cashmere and the 68-year-old face of a man who'd built a billion-dollar empire and was standing in a small studio on a Tuesday morning because he was scared. Actually scared. She'd thought about this. Since the car last night. Since Sandra Voss and since Evelyn's phone call. She'd thought about what Roman would do when the walls closed in. She'd thought about the warehouse and the sandwich and what do you need and the document. And yes, when he could have said anything else. She picked up the document from her bag, set it on the cutting table between them. Harrington looked at it. "I'm not your ally," she said. "I'm not Roman's instrument. I'm not Vanessa's project." She looked at him steadily. "I'm a person with a business and a name that belongs to me, and I've spent 3 years building both of those things without anyone's help. Whatever happens between you and Roman Mercer, whatever federal attention materializes, my name is going to stay exactly where it belongs. Not because you've convinced me of anything, because I've already decided it." She slid the document across the table toward him. "Take it. It's a copy. I don't need it." He looked at her. Then at the document, he picked it up. At the door, he stopped, turned halfway. "You're more careful than he deserves," he said. "That's not for you to assess," she said. He left. She stood alone in her studio. Her hands were completely steady. She looked at them as if verifying this. Then her phone rang. She looked at the screen. "Roman," she answered. "I know Harrington came to see you," he said. His voice was different. Not the controlled steadiness she'd catalogued. The steadiness was there, but something was moving underneath it. "One of my people flagged his car outside your building. He came and went. I'm fine." "What did he say?" She was quiet for a moment. "He told me you'd use me as leverage when the Kellerman situation escalates." Silence on the line. "Is he right?" she said. The silence stretched. She listened to it. She'd learned to listen to his silences, the way she listened to fabric under tension for what they were holding, for where they were about to give. "No," Roman said. "He's not right. Tell me why I should believe that over a man who's had 15 years to watch you operate. Because Harrington watches me from the outside." His voice was tight, not with anger, with something that required more effort to hold. then anger. He knows what I do. He doesn't know why I do it. And he has never in 15 years seen me protect something the way I'd protect you. She pressed her back against the cutting table. Roman, I need to see you. The tightness broke slightly on the last word. Not dramatic, just the seam showing. I know you need time. I heard you. But there's something happening that you need to know about directly, and I can't say it on a phone. The hair on her arms went up. What's happening? She said. The federal situation. It moved faster than I expected. A pause. There's going to be a meeting tonight. Not optional. People I can't avoid. And your studio came up in a context I need to explain to you before someone else does. She felt it in her chest. The cold thing. Where? She said. He gave her an address. A building near the river. Not his office. Not neutral. His. She understood what that meant, that whatever was happening was serious enough that the careful separations of the last 6 weeks were no longer operable. That the wall he'd built between his world and hers had cracked. 7 o'clock, he said. I'll be there. She put the phone down. She stood in her studio in the morning light with the fabric bolts and the cutting tables and the precision of everything she'd built, and she felt not afraid. Something seen. Something more specific than afraid. The feeling of a person standing at the edge of a decision that will define the shape of everything that comes after. She'd spent 3 years building without anyone's help. She'd spent 6 weeks building with someone who had kept something from her. Now that someone was asking her to walk into the part of his world he'd specifically promised she'd never have to enter. Because her name, the one she'd put on her own building, had already been pulled into it without her knowledge or consent. She had 7 hours. She spent the first one calling Sandra Voss. She spent the next 2 at her cutting table, working, because the fabric didn't lie and the work didn't change. And whatever was going to happen tonight, the prototype that needed finishing, still needed finishing, and she was not going to let Richard Harrington or Roman Mercer or any version of this situation take from her the one thing that had always been entirely hers. By 4 in the afternoon, she had a finished piece, a small section, of the new pattern she'd been developing, amber gold and something darker underneath, the 2 tones woven together in a way that neither overwhelmed the other. She held it up to the light. It was good work. It was genuinely good work. She set it down carefully, folded it, placed it in the drawer where she kept the pieces she was proud of. Then she got her coat. The address Roman had given her was on the 23rd floor of a building she'd passed 100 times, without knowing what it contained. The lobby security was the kind that doesn't advertise itself. She gave her name at the desk. A man in a suit she hadn't seen before met her at the elevator. 23rd floor. A room with floor-to-ceiling windows, and the Chicago River below, black and moving. Roman was there. So were 2 other men older, contained the specific quality of men who had occupied serious rooms for decades and had learned to take up exactly the space they needed, and no more. And across the room, seated separately, looking at her with an expression she couldn't categorize, Ethan Caldwell. She stopped inside the doorway. The man who had ended 4 years with a text message. The man who had laughed at her. Across a ballroom. The man who had walked into her workspace at 9 o'clock at night with concern wearing the clothes of self-interest. He was here, in Roman Mercer's building. She looked at Roman. Roman's face was doing the thing it did when he was holding something the controlled surface over the moving thing underneath, but his eyes were direct and they were communicating something specific. I didn't know he would be here. She believed him. She also understood that it didn't matter. Whatever was about to happen in this room was the convergence of every thread from the last 6 weeks, from 3 years ago, from a text message, from a dark ballroom and a caught wrist and a question about fabric and an amber-lit wedding and a document in an attorney's office, all of it pulling toward this moment like water finding its level. She walked into the room. She did not look at Ethan again. She looked at Roman. "Tell me everything," she said. Roman looked at her, at the woman who had turned back to the fabric panel when he laughed, who had fixed the lighting error at 9:30 at night, who had stood in his conference room and said what I told you in those rooms was not a performance and meant every syllable, and he began to speak. Roman spoke for 11 minutes without stopping. Claire stood near the window and listened. She did not sit down. She did not interrupt. She listened the way she worked, with her full attention committed, nothing held back for the performance of listening, all of it directed at the actual content of what was being said. The Kellerman arrangement had been Roman's mechanism for moving capital from his criminal operations into legitimate real estate structures over an 18-month period. Richard Harrington had entered the arrangement knowingly. Roman was precise about this, and the two older men in the room, whose names she still didn't have, didn't contradict it as a way to clean his own exposure from 3 land deals in the early 2000s that had involved city officials and money that had never been publicly accounted for. The arrangement had worked cleanly for 14 months. 3 months ago, a mid-level associate in Roman's organization named Victor Greal had begun skimming from the shell accounts, small amounts, carefully timed, the kind of theft that requires intimate knowledge of the structure. Greal had been identified 2 weeks ago. Greal had also, in the preceding month, made contact with a federal investigator, which meant the federal investigator had a source inside the structure, which meant the investigator had a map of the Kellerman arrangement, which meant the timeline on exposure was not months. It was weeks, possibly less. Roman's name in the document Vanessa had provided came from Greal's access to internal records. Records that Greal had photographed and provided upstream before Roman's people identified the breach. This was what Roman had known when he presented the investment proposal. This was the liability he'd believed was contained. He'd been wrong. Claire absorbed all of this without her expression changing significantly. She was aware of Ethan across the room, aware of him the way you're aware of something peripheral that you've decided not to give the satisfaction of direct attention. And she was aware of the 2 older men watching her with the particular assessment of people determining whether she was a problem or a variable. When Roman finished, the room was quiet. "Why is he here?" Claire said. She didn't look at Ethan. She looked at Roman. Roman's jaw tightened slightly. Harrington sent him as a representative. Richard didn't want to be in the room himself. A representative for what purpose? One of the older men, gray-haired, a face like weathered concrete, spoke for the first time. "Mr. Caldwell has been made aware of the scope of the Kellerman exposure. The Harrington family's position is that certain arrangements can be made to limit the federal visibility of the structure, provided all parties cooperate with a coordinated approach to the documentation." Claire finally looked at Ethan. He was looking at her. He'd been looking at her since she walked in. His face had the expression she'd seen in her studio, the discomfort, the calculation. But there was something new in it now. Something that looked almost like shame, except that shame requires acknowledgement of what you've done. And she wasn't sure Ethan had arrived at that particular address yet. "What do you need from me, specifically?" she said. The gray-haired man opened a folder on the table in front of him. "Your contracts with Mercer Holdings create a documentation trail that, if characterized correctly, could either complicate or simplify the federal investigators' understanding of the fund movements. We need to know which direction your cooperation points." The sentence was constructed very carefully. She understood every word of what it was actually saying. "You want to know if I'll characterize my contracts in a way that supports your version of events," she said. "We want to know where you stand." "I stand where I've always stood." She looked at the man steadily. "The contracts I signed were legitimate. I'll describe them accurately. That's what I'm willing to do. Accurate description might be the only description I'm capable of producing." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "I'm a textile designer with a studio in Wicker Park. I produced custom fabrics and event decor for a private wedding through a legitimate business contract. That's what happened. That's what I'll say if anyone asks me. I'm not going to adjust the characterization to benefit anyone in this room, including myself." The gray-haired man looked at Roman. Roman looked at Claire. Something crossed his face, something she'd seen once before, in the conference room at 11 o'clock at night, when she'd said, "It's me, deciding what I want my life to look like." He'd recognized something then. He was recognizing something now. A different thing, but in the same category. "That's her answer," Roman said to the room. "We don't need to revisit it." The gray-haired man's expression shifted. Not hostility, recalibration. The assessment of a man who had expected a variable and encountered a fixed point. Ethan spoke, Claire. His voice came from across the room. Quiet. The version she'd once found hardest to resist. "You don't owe these people anything." She looked at him. "I know," she said, "then walk out. Just leave. Whatever Mercer's told you about." "Ethan." She said his name the way she'd said Roman's in the car, like a closed door. "You're here because Richard Harrington needed someone expendable to sit in this room in his place." You know that, right? He went still. You're not a representative. You're a buffer. If this meeting goes badly for the Harrington family, you're the person whose name is on the attendance list instead of Richard's. She held his gaze. You came here because Vanessa's father needed someone whose career he could afford to sacrifice, and you've spent 4 years making yourself exactly that person. That's not Roman's doing. That's not mine. That's yours. The room was very quiet. Ethan's face moved through several things: the discomfort, the calculation, and then something that broke through both. Not anger, something rawer than anger. The face of a man who has been accurately described in public for the first time. He said nothing. She turned back to the gray-haired man. I'm going to leave now. If federal investigators contact my studio, I'll cooperate fully with accurate information about my contracts. If you need anything further from me in this context, contact my attorney. She reached into her bag and placed Sandra Voss's card on the table. Good night. She picked up her bag. She walked to the door. Claire Roman's voice. She stopped, did not turn around immediately, took one breath, then turned. He was standing where he'd been standing, but something had shifted in his posture, the controlled surface, at partial rest, the way a person stands when they've stopped performing the management of themselves and are just standing. I'll deal with this, he said. The exposure, the federal situation, I'll deal with it. It won't reach your studio. I know you'll try, she said. I'll succeed. She looked at him, at the face she'd been reading for 6 weeks, at the scar below his ear and the eyes that had been paying attention since a dark ballroom, at the man who had said yes when he could have said anything else. I believe you'll try very hard, she said. That's where I am right now. That's honest. He held her gaze. He nodded once. She left. The elevator was empty, and she was glad for that. She watched the numbers descend and breathed, and did not perform composure for the empty elevator, because there was no one to perform it for. A sound like green wood splitting, which meant she could feel the actual weight of the pressing down on her shoulder and the base of her throat, and the place behind her sternum where the thing she'd been holding in check had been building. She breathed it through. Lobby, cold air, the river smell that comes off Chicago in October at night, that particular combination of cold water and industry, and something that might be the city's particular definition of alive. She walked to her car, got in, put both hands on the steering wheel, and sat. She did not cry. She wasn't at the point of tears, she was past it, the way extreme cold goes past, feeling cold into something that just registers as pressure. She was past the point where emotions had the luxury of expression and into the territory of pure processing, taking in information, converting it into something she could act on. She started the car and drove to her studio. The studio at 11 at night had its own quality of silence. Not empty full of the work, the fabric, the organized precision she'd built and maintained through 3 years of building alone. The cutting table and the machines and the bolts of fabric in their ordered rows and the mood boards still pinned with swatches and the prototype she'd folded and put in the drawer that morning. She turned on the work lights over the cutting table. Not the overhead fluorescence, just the focused light over the work surface. The rest of the studio stayed in shadow. She sat down on the work stool. She was going to be all right. She knew this with the same instinctive certainty she applied to fabric when something was right. She knew it in her hands before she knew it in her head. She was going to be all right because she had been all right before, in harder circumstances, with less to stand on. 3 years ago, she'd had 4 years of her life restructured by 7 words, and she'd set a 20-minute timer and then washed her face and gone back to the cutting table. She had more now than she'd had then. More clients, more work, more of her and more rooms, more understanding of what she was capable of and what she was willing to accept and where the line was between the two. She pulled the prototype from the drawer, the amber gold piece, the 2 tones woven together, neither one overwhelming the other. She held it under the work light. It was good. It was genuinely good. She could see the places where the tension was slightly uneven, where a more careful hand arrested hand. Not the 11 o'clock hand that had made it would have kept the weight more consistent. She could see exactly what it would take to make it better. She could also see what it already was. She was still looking at it when she heard the knock at the studio door. She didn't tense. She wasn't afraid. She'd locked the door behind her. Whoever it was had knocked instead of trying the handle, which already told her something. She went to the door and looked through the glass. Roman Mercer was standing on the sidewalk in the cold, with his hands in his coat pockets, not positioned to demand entry, not performing the authority of a man accustomed to entering rooms when he arrived at them. Just standing. She unlocked the door. She didn't open it wide. Just enough. How did the meeting end? Badly for Harrington. His voice was tired in a way she hadn't heard in 6 weeks of late nights. The fatigue that comes not from hours of work, but from the kind of room she'd just been in. Harrington's attorney is going to cut a cooperation agreement. Richard throws the Kellerman structure into the light in exchange for consideration on the older land deal exposure. The move I would have made in his position. And you? My attorney is already in conversation with the federal team. The Kellerman arrangement is complicated, but it's not unprecedented. There are outcomes that don't require. He stopped. Outcomes that keep the things I need to keep. Like what? He looked at her through the gap in the door. My sister's marriage isn't touched. The legitimate businesses hold. The people who depend on those businesses hold. A pause. And your studio is nowhere in any of it. Sandra Voss will get a call from my attorney tomorrow, confirming this directly. She processed this. Ethan? He left before the meeting ended. Harrington's attorney called him out. A beat. He's not going to be an issue for you. He understands the position he was placed in tonight. He understood it before he walked in, she said. He just hoped the math would work out differently. Probably. She looked at Roman standing on her sidewalk in the October cold. He was not asking to come in. He was not leveraging the tiredness in his voice or the information he'd just given her. It's upperneed. He was standing on her sidewalk the way he'd picked up sandwiches at the warehouse visit and waited while she read contracts at coffee tables with the particular patience of a man who had learned that some things cannot be pressured into happening. Come in, she said. She stepped back. He came in. She went to the small counter at the back of the studio, where she kept a kettle and 2 mugs, because she and Marcus had learned early that some days required more coffee than the nearest cafe could provide efficiently. She turned on the kettle. Roman stood inside the door and looked at the studio. She'd seen him like room splitting. She'd seen him in polished rooms and conference spaces and a ballroom she built from scratch, but she'd never had him in here in the actual room where the work happened. He looked at it carefully, not assessing the value. The way a person looks at something that tells them about another person. He looked at the prototype on the cutting table, the amber gold piece still sitting where she'd set it when she heard the knock. You were working, he said. I was looking at something I made. She poured the water when it boiled, brought 2 mugs to the cutting table. Sit down. He sat on the extra stool at the edge of the table. She sat on her work stool. Close, the cutting table was not large, and in the focused light over the work surface, the shadow of the rest of the studio around them had a quality she recognized as specific to late nights in this space, when the work had been long and the room had contracted to just the pool of light and what was in it. He wrapped his hands around the mug. She looked at his hands. The knuckles of his right hand had an old irregularity she'd noticed before and never asked about. She wasn't going to ask about it tonight. I need to ask you something, she said, and I need you to answer the way you answered in the car. Not the managed version, he nodded. When you walked into that meeting tonight and saw Ethan there, what did you feel? He looked at his mug, then at her. Like I'd failed to build something solid enough to keep your name out of a room like that. Not anger at Harrington for sending him, that too. But underneath the anger, he paused. There's a version of a man who keeps everyone at a distance and never has this problem. I've been that version for a long time. He held her gaze. I stopped wanting to be that version about 6 weeks ago. And this is the tax on that. She thought about that. You think letting people matter is what creates exposure. In my experience. Then your experience has been with people who use the access. He was quiet. I'm not going to use the access, she said. I'm also not going to pretend that what you withheld didn't matter. It did. It does. The Kellerman thing, you made a decision about my risk tolerance without asking me. That's not something I can just set aside. Because tonight went the way it went. It would happen again, she said, not the same way, but the same structure. You making a decision about what I need to know based on what you think you can manage. That's the pattern in your world. That's how it works. Yes, he said. I'm not built for that. I know you're not. He looked at her without flinching. Is why I need to be different from the pattern. Not claim I am. Actually be it. She looked at the prototype. At the 2 tones woven together, neither one overwhelming the other. I'm going to tell you something, she said, and you're going to let me say all of it before you respond. He waited. 3 years ago, Ethan left me because he decided I wasn't the right version of successful. He didn't tell me this. He sent 7 words and left me to figure out the rest. And I spent 2 years after that making sure that what I built was mine, completely mine, so that no one would ever again have the standing to decide whether it was enough. She looked at her hands. When you walked into my professional life, I let it in slowly and carefully because I was watching for the version of Ethan that lives in men who have more power than they know what to do with. The version that decides what you need, what you can handle, what you get to know. She looked up. You're not him, she said. I want to be precise about that. You made a bad decision about disclosure. You didn't make it out of contempt. There's a difference, and I know the difference. She held his gaze. But I need you to understand that the thing I'm most protective of is not my studio. It's my own judgment. I spent 4 years not trusting it with Ethan, and when I finally listened to it, it took me 3 more years to rebuild what not listening had cost. Roman was very still. If this, whatever this is, continues, she said, I need to be a person who decides things with accurate information, not protected from the hard information, not managed. Informed. That's the requirement. Yes, he said. That's it? That's the whole word? That's the whole word. His voice was quiet and without performance. Yes, that's the requirement, and I accept it. Not because it's the right answer to give you, because it's the only way this works, the only way any of it works, including the parts of my life I've been rebuilding for longer than 6 weeks. She looked at him. She thought about Evelyn's voice on the phone that morning. He changed the meeting schedule around your calendar. She thought about the warehouse and the space he'd given her to solve the problem. She thought about the question, what do you need? The silence in the car? And the truth when truth would have been easier to shape. She picked up her mug. Drank. He drank. They sat in the work light in the quiet studio for a while without speaking, which was something she'd learned was possible with Roman Mercer, that the silence between them didn't require filling. The investment, she said eventually. The proposal stands whenever you're ready. Or not at all, if that's where you land. The terms don't change. My attorney will send Sandra Voss the Kellerman resolution documentation when it's finalized 6 to 8 weeks, and you can make the decision with full information. 6 to 8 weeks, she said, give or take. And in that time, he looked at her. I want to have dinner, she said. Not a business dinner. Not with 3 security people at the next table. An actual dinner. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Close, where he said. Somewhere I pick. Okay. Somewhere that has nothing to do with your world, or Ethan's world, or any part of the last 6 weeks. Also okay. I'll text you. I'll answer in under 4 minutes. She looked at him. You knew I noticed that. I noticed you noticing. She looked away. Looked at the prototype again. At the amber gold, the 2 tones, the place where the tension was slightly uneven, and the place where it held perfectly. Go home, she said. Not harshly. It's late and you look like you've been in that room for 12 hours. 14, he said. He stood up, carried his mug to the counter and set it down, which she registered the automatic tidiness of it, the complete absence of the expectation that someone else would handle it. At the door he stopped. She was still at the cutting table, her hands around her mug, the work light making a circle of the space they'd been occupying. The wedding, he said. What Evelyn said when she saw the room. What she said to me after. She waited. She said it felt like someone had made all of it specifically for her. He held her gaze. That's what you do. You make things feel like they were made for a specific person. That's not a skill. That's a way of seeing people. A pause. I noticed it the first night, in the dark. You were the only person moving toward the problem. She looked at him. I know, she said quietly. He opened the door. Cold air moved in briefly. Good night, Claire. Good night. The door closed. She sat in the work light for another hour before she went home. The federal investigation moved on a 6-week timeline, as Roman's attorney had projected. Richard Harrington's cooperation agreement was executed in the 4th week. The Kellerman arrangement was fully documented in the federal record. Roman's name appeared in the chain at 2 removes present, visible, but not the primary instrument, and not the subject of criminal charges. His attorney negotiated a civil settlement involving financial penalties and mandatory cooperation with the restructuring of 3 subsidiary entities. Sandra Voss called Claire in the 5th week to walk her through the resolution documents. Claire sat at her kitchen table with coffee and listened and asked 4 precise questions and received 4 precise answers. Her studio was not named. Her contracts were not in the record. Her name appeared nowhere in the proceeding. Sandra Voss confirmed what she'd assessed at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night in pajama pants and boots. The exposure had been real but contained, and it had now been resolved. Claire thanked her, filed the call summary in her attorney folder, made a note in her financial planner to pay Sandra Voss's invoice in full by the end of the month. Then she went to her studio and worked. She texted Roman in the 6th week. The restaurant she chose was in Logan Square, a small Italian place that had been there since the 80s. The kind of restaurant that doesn't take reservations for parties under 4 and doesn't care who you are, where the tablecloths were checkered and the lighting was warm and the noise level was exactly sufficient to make a private conversation private without requiring effort. She'd eaten there twice before with Marcus, celebrating completed projects with the particular low-key satisfaction of work well done. Roman arrived 4 minutes after she did. He was in a dark jacket, no tie. He looked at the restaurant from the doorway with an expression she'd become expert at reading, the brief calibration of a man encountering something outside his usual environment, followed by the decision to be in it without reservation. He sat down across from her, no security at the adjacent table. She'd specified this and he'd honored it, and she saw the choice in the way he held himself slightly more exposed than his default, making the concession visible without making a production of it. They ordered without elaborate deliberation. Red wine, pasta, bread that arrived in a basket without being requested, which was the specific sign of a restaurant that understood what dinner was supposed to feel like. They talked. Not about the Kellerman situation. Not about the federal resolution. Not about her studio's finances or his restructured subsidiaries, or any of the specific weight they'd been carrying for 6 weeks. They talked the way two people talk when the emergency is over, and what remains is the question of what they are to each other in ordinary time. Splitting. He told her about growing up in a part of Chicago that has its own specific grammar of survival, the kind of neighborhood where the men who made it out were fewer than the men who didn't, and where the distinction between those two groups was often luck as much as character, and where he'd spent 15 years telling himself that understanding this was the same as being free of it. She told him about her mother, who had been a seamstress in a dry cleaning shop, and who had called Claire's decision to start a studio ambitious in a tone that meant something closer to reckless, and who had revised this opinion 17 months ago when she came to Chicago and saw Claire Whitmore textile design on a door and stood in front of it for a full minute without saying anything. She cried. Roman said. She denied it and then changed the subject. Which means yes. He almost smiled. The real version, not the corner-of-the-mouth version. She'd seen it only twice before, and she'd noted each time. What did she say when she stopped denying it? She said the sign was crooked. Claire picked up her wine. The sign was perfectly level. She'd measured it with a level app on her phone before my mother arrived. Roman laughed. Actually laughed the kind that arrives without preparation, and is already gone before you can decide whether to perform it. Brief, real, slightly startled sounding. She liked it. She filed it. They ate slowly. The restaurant did what a good restaurant does, which is become invisible, the way good fabric does not notice, just felt. The end of the meal, while they were waiting for what, he put his hand on the table, not reaching across, just there present. She looked at it. The old irregularity in the knuckles she'd decided not to ask about. She was going to ask about it eventually. Not tonight. Tonight she put her hand next to his, on the checkered tablecloth, not in his, next to it, and they sat like that while the restaurant moved around them and the city moved outside. The investment, she said. The documentation went to Voss last week. I know, she called. She looked at their hands on the table. I'm going to sign it. He didn't respond immediately. She felt his attention shift, the full weight of it, the thing she'd been aware of since the dark ballroom. You're sure, he said. I've looked at the terms 14 times. I've had Sandra look at them twice. The structure is clean. The control provisions are exactly what you promised, and the capital solves a real problem for my studio. She met his eyes. And yes, I'm sure. Okay, I'm going to need quarterly documentation reviews. Yes. And if anything changes in the underlying financial structure, I get notified before I read about it somewhere else. She looked at him steadily. Accurate information. That's the requirement. That's the requirement, he said. I heard it the first time. The check came. She put her card down before he could reach for his. He looked at it. My pick, she said, my tab. He looked at her for a moment. Then he let it be. Outside on the sidewalk, the November cold had a different quality than October, less warning, more arrival. She buttoned her coat. He stood nearby. "I'll walk to my car," she said. "You don't need to walk me, I know." She looked at him. "Walk me anyway." They walked half a block to where she'd parked. The neighborhood was quiet enough at this hour that their footsteps had presence on the sidewalk. She was aware of the distance between them, the specific few inches of not quite touching that is its own kind of contact. At her car, she stopped. He stopped beside her. She turned to look at him. He was looking at her with the full weight of his attention, the way he'd been looking at her since the first night, the focused stillness that she'd spent 6 weeks learning to read and still didn't have a complete vocabulary for. She took one step toward him. He didn't move, didn't lean in, didn't presume. With the same patient quality that had been present since the first Tuesday morning when she'd said 11 instead of 10, and he'd said 11 and meant it. Kissed him. Brief. Certain. The kind of kiss that isn't testing something but declaring it. She stepped back. He looked at her. "Okay," he said quietly. The same word he'd used when she'd laid out the requirements, but different now, carrying more weight, a different kind of settlement. "Okay," she said. She got in her car. He stood on the sidewalk and watched her pull out. She saw him in the rearview mirror, standing in the November cold, hands in his coat pockets, not moving until she'd turned the corner. She drove home. The renovation began in January. Claire had found the building in December, a 2-story brick structure in the West Loop that had been a textile warehouse in a previous life, which she took as the specific kind of sign that doesn't require a name to mean something. The bones were good. The first floor needed work. The second floor needed gutting and rebuilding from the studs. She'd spent 3 weeks going through the renovation plans with the same attention she gave to complex fabric structures, tracking every load-bearing decision, every material choice, every way the building's original character could be honored rather than erased. The investment capital made it possible. Her own revenue, stabilized by the contracts that had followed Evelyn's wedding, made it sustainable. The combination of both meant she could do it without compromising either. She was very precise about this. The precision mattered to her in a way she didn't feel the need to explain to anyone, but could have explained exactly if asked. She'd spent 3 years building something that belonged entirely to herself, and she was not going to allow the expansion of that thing to compromise the ownership of it. The investment was capital, documented and structured. Her name was on the deed. Her decisions ran the build-out. Marcus handled the vendor coordination for the renovation, with the same competence he'd brought to 6 weeks of event logistics. Priya, who had started as a part-time student and was now full-time, managed the permit paperwork with a thoroughness that made Claire decide she was going to be offered a title increase before the end of the year. Roman came to the building once in January, when the demolition was underway on the second floor. He looked at the exposed studs and the brick and the dust and the organized chaos of a serious renovation project and asked 3 structural questions that revealed he'd actually studied the building plans she'd mentioned once in passing. She showed him where the training room was going to be. The large second-floor space with the east-facing windows, good light for pattern work, for detail work, for the kind of learning that requires seeing things clearly. "Who teaches?" he said. "Me, some of the time. I'm working on recruiting 2 other designers, one who specializes in technical tailoring, one in business development." She looked at the exposed brick of the east wall. "I want women who come from the same kind of place I came from, to have somewhere to go that isn't $15,000 a year in design school tuition they can't afford." He looked at the wall with her. "That's a significant operation," he said. "Yes, you're going to need administrative support you don't currently have." "I know, I'm building the staffing model. It's part of the second phase planning." He was quiet for a moment. "I know people, legitimate people, HR consultants, workforce development organizations that work on programs like this. Not connected to my operation, just contacts, if it's useful." She looked at him. "Send me the names," she said. "I'll evaluate them. That's all I'm offering, I know." She held his gaze. "That's why I said yes." The sign went up in March. Whitmore Textile House. White letters on a dark ground mounted above the renovated entrance of the West Loop building. The sign company had sent a crew of 2 who'd done the installation in 3 hours on a Tuesday morning, while Claire stood on the sidewalk in the cold and watched and corrected the alignment twice, because she'd inherited from her mother the knowledge that close enough was not the same as right. When the crew left, she stood in front of it. just stood. The street was doing what streets do, moving, making noise, having nothing to do with the specific weight of a particular moment. A delivery truck went by. Someone walked a dog. The city continued. She looked at her name above the door of a building she owned. She thought about the cutting table in the first studio, the second-hand one, the one with the leg she'd had to shim with a folded piece of cardboard for 8 months because she couldn't afford to replace it. She thought about the 20-minute timer, about a text message, 7 words, arriving on a Tuesday morning 3 years ago while she was eating toast over the sink. She thought about a dark ballroom and a hand catching her weight and a question, "Are you hurt?" She thought about amber light and Evelyn's hand reaching backward for Daniel. She thought about a conference room at 11 o'clock and a man saying, "What do you need?" She thought about a car moving through an intersection and the city lights on the windows, and yes, when the easier word was anything else. She thought about a checkered tablecloth and a hand next to hers and a first kiss on a November sidewalk that wasn't testing anything. She thought about none of it as a sequence of events that had happened to her. She thought about all of it as a record of what she'd done, the decisions she'd made, the ones she'd refused to make, the things she'd protected, and the things she'd let in. She heard footsteps behind her. She didn't turn around immediately. She knew the sound. She'd learned the sound, the specific weight and cadence that she'd been cataloging since a dark ballroom. Roman stopped beside her. He looked up at the sign. They stood there together on the sidewalk in March, the city moving around them, the sign holding still above the door. "Straight," he said. "I checked it 4 times. "I know. I watched you check it." She looked at him. He was looking at the sign with an expression she didn't have a category for yet, but she was building one. She was building the vocabulary for his face, the way she built everything. Carefully, with attention, one piece at a time. "Evelyn called this morning," he said. "I know, she texted me from Rome. She sent a photo of a market she found local textiles. She wants to know if I can source from the same region. Can you? Probably. I'll look into it." He looked at her. The full weight of his attention, the thing she'd stopped trying to deflect. "You built this," he said. "Yes. From the ground up. On your own terms. With your capital," she said. "I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Capital is available from a lot of places. What's above that door belongs to the person who knew what to do with it." He held her gaze. "That was never me." She looked back at the sign. Whitmore Textile House. Her name. Her building, her work. Roman hadn't rescued her. She'd been absolutely clear about this from the beginning, in the deepest part of herself, where the clear things lived, the part that had set a 20-minute timer 3 years ago, and then washed her face and gone back to the cutting table. She had not needed rescuing. She had needed capital, and she had found a source, and she had verified it, and structured it, and maintained control of it. She had needed a client whose event would open doors, and she had performed the work that earned those doors. She had needed time, and she had taken it, without permission from anyone. What Roman had given her, what he'd given her that she hadn't known she was missing, was simpler and harder to name. The specific experience of being seen without being managed, of being known without being handled, of someone standing beside her without requiring her to be smaller or easier, or less than what she was. She understood, standing in front of her building in March, that this was not a small thing. It was not the small thing that the person who had spent 4 years next to Ethan Caldwell had once believed it was. It was in fact the only thing. She turned to Roman. He was watching her with the full attention, stillness. Waiting the way he had always waited, not passive, not pressuring, just present. She put her hand in his. He looked down at their hands, then at her. Something moved through his face, not the composed surface, not the controlled quality, but the thing underneath. She was getting better at reading the thing underneath. "Come inside," she said. "I want to show you where the training room windows are going." She unlocked the door of Whitmore Textile House. They walked in together. Behind them, the March sun was doing what March sun does in Chicago, making promises it might not keep, offering light without much warmth yet, the particular quality of a season that has not fully committed, but has stopped pretending it isn't coming. The door closed. The sign above the entrance caught the light. Inside, 2 floors of finished space waited the studio below, with its cutting tables and fabric bolts, and the organized precision of work done seriously, and the training room above with its east-facing windows, and its good clear light, ready for the women who would come and the things they would learn, and the names they would one day put on their own doors with. Outside the city continued. Claire Whitmore had built this. All of it. Exactly this. And she had done it in the only way that had ever worked, by turning back to the work, by refusing to stop, by understanding at some point that the people who had underestimated her had not done so because she was less than they believed. They had done so because they were less than she had needed them to be. She had simply spent years learning the difference. Now she was done learning it. Now there was only the work, and the building, and the name above the door, and a man who had enough sense to walk in beside her without making it about anything other than what it was. The door closed on everything behind it, and Claire Whitmore, who had always known how to begin again, went to work.